Hi, folks. So glad that you joined me for this conversation with the Cool Grandpa podcast. Today's conversation is with Lauren Huff. I met Lauren through Dan Miller's 48 Days community, and we hit it off. I found out that she's doing a project that's a podcast and a blog called Returning Time, where she's going through, starting out by interviewing her grandfathers and her grandmothers about their interesting life experiences. So she's capturing the immigrant experience from the standpoint of Sicilians immigrating to New Orleans and then on to California. And she's also diving into the background of just how the family came up in California during the Depression and everything involved in her grandparents' life. What we're going to do is dive in, have this conversation with Lauren, and then also, folks, be sure to check out the show notes because I will put a link to Lauren's Returning Time podcast as well as Dan Miller's 48 Days community. So if you're interested in either one of those, it's easy to find. Just go to www.cool-grandpa.us and look at the show notes for this episode. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Lauren, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk with me on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I really do appreciate the time that you're taking, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about your grandfathers, and then, of course, we'll get into your project that you've got that I'm very excited to hear more about, and I think it's unique, and I believe the listeners are going to enjoy hearing what your project is with documenting your grandfather.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So for my story, I grew up in California, and most of my grandparents were about 30 miles away from me, with the exception of one grandfather who lived in Florida. But with my grandpas in particular, I remember watching them with their various activities. You know, they each had their own passions. One, is really great at woodworking, and it was really exciting to watch him build things out of his shed. He would build cabinets and toy chests and trash cans, like nice ones. So everyone in our family kind of has a trash can from him, and we all know who made it. So and then my papa is a Sicilian American. Both of his parents were children of immigrants. His story, he's very, very educated, very knowledgeable and passionate about history. And so he's really, knows a lot about the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, about our family. So that's something that I really share with him. So we would go to Civil War reenactments that would happen locally. We would go to museums together and plays and lots of arts and historic events together. And so that was always just so much fun.
Oh, very cool. As a big-time history junkie, especially the two areas that I love and study a lot are the American Civil War and then the events prior to leading up to World War II. Sounds like myself and Papa would get along just absolutely fine. And I absolutely love living on the East Coast. I've got great opportunities where I've been to Gettysburg and Antietam. I've been here in Atlanta, Kennesaw Mountain, Chattanooga, all sorts of these battlefields. So I'm sure he'd probably be a little jealous that I've been able to walk some of these things that he may have only read about.
Yeah, actually, he makes a point to go to these places. So he's actually been to Gettysburg, I think at least once. And so he actually told me a really interesting story recently where his wife's family had a soldier who was on the Union side, I believe, and they found letters from him, and they were able to place where he was when he wrote one of the letters. It was before a battle. I can't remember which one, but I believe it'll be on my podcast. And he went through that whole area, and so he loves that, and he's been to Sicily as well and visited some of the spots where my family is from. So he's one of those who he doesn't just read about it. He goes and he wants to explore it. He wants to be there, and I really appreciate that about him.
Oh, that's the best way to do it. And, I just encourage that anybody that's interested in history, if you have a chance to go walk the ground, see the buildings, whatever you're interested in, it'll make such an impact on you. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about what the relationship was like with the grandfathers when you were younger, like elementary school age, and what were some of the activities and memories that you have around those times?
Yeah, so Christmas usually was a very big holiday with my papa particularly. We would go and see him on Christmas Eve. And then I remember the next day we would always go to his sister's house. And so most of the people who were there the day before, we would see on Christmas as well at Christmas dinner. And so that's always been, I felt like Christmas Eve was always just this holiday I knew, like, I'm going to my papa's house. And he loves trains. And so he has a train set that goes around his den. And all of the grandchildren would we'd always be begging him, like, turn on the train, and we just all get a kick out of that. And it's sort of exciting now. My daughter's almost 7 and the train's still there. He's still in the same house. And, her and my cousins that are about that age are turn on the train. And so it's just really exciting for them. And I love the memories surrounding Christmas and the holidays at my papa's house.
Yeah.
And then with my, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, it's amazing how impactful and long-lasting those memories are around holidays and traditions, especially. Whether it was Christmas or we always did a 4th of July picnic or whatever it may be, that consistency and that tradition that you can always associate with, this is always what we did with my grandparents, or this is always what we did with grandpa, just sticks with you, the rest of your life. For any grandfathers, don't shortcut those traditions. And if you put a train set out, once for the grandkids, make sure you're putting that train set out, every year, because that builds up those memories and those connections.
Yes, for sure. And, something I really appreciate about my grandfather, again, is just his storytelling. It's interesting now hearing him tell these stories, because I remember sitting at his feet, with him in his recliner, and he'd sit down and tell us these stories about when he was a kid and growing up, and about his parents, and just all sorts of stories that he just has stored away in his head. And, it's so interesting because I remember him telling them, but I know he parted down. It was very at our level. And then as I got older, the stories would become more mature. They wouldn't change, but he never stopped telling them. Even though we had heard it before, he never stopped telling them. And now those stories are ingrained in my own memories. And I appreciate them a whole lot now that I'm an adult, especially.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting too that you were talking about that the stories didn't change, but they probably had more detail around them as you were getting older and could appreciate the detail that would be coming out. There's a story levels that are appropriate. Well, for a 3-year-old versus a 7-year-old, just within those young years.
Yeah, right now I'm reading my daughter Junie B. Jones, and she wants to read the whole story every day. She's ready for those less pictures, more details. But yes, definitely, he was really, really good at that, really skilled at that. scaling the stories with our ages.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, you were about to talk about your other grandfather too, with some of the memories that you had from those early years. So why don't we go back and revisit that?
Yeah. So my grandpa Jerry, he is actually my dad's stepfather, but him and my grandma Marlene have been married since before I was born. And so my grandpa Jerry is he's just a really funny man. He's sort of the king of the dad jokes, and just always kind of like teasing you and pulling your leg and that sort of thing. So, he would just, if you made a funny face at him, he would say, "Your face will grow that way." And, he'll say things like, "Well, I'm glad you got to see me," and things like that. And so, I've realized as I've gotten older that other people say it too, but it's always sweet when I hear someone else say it because I think about my grandpa Jerry. And my grandpa Jerry is the one that does a lot of woodworking. He worked really, really hard in his life. He worked for a local newspaper, doing the sales until he retired. But one of his passion projects was definitely his woodworking and building things for other people. And usually they were gifts. I commissioned him to make something once, and he refused to take anything over the materials, the cost of materials. So he just has always had a passion for that. But my grandpa Jerry is funny because he can also be scary. I do. I've learned to respect him because I wasn't always the greatest, kid. We all had our moments where we would act up with our grandparents and push the boundaries a little bit. And so I would spend a lot of time with him and my grandma Marlene during the holidays, when my parents were working. And I remember one time he was such a funny man that one time I like slammed the door and got mad at them for something. I don't know. I was throwing a fit about something. And they made me come back in, get back in here, Lauren, And my grandma like put me in front of my grandpa Jerry because he wanted to talk to me about it. And he like shook his finger at me and was like, "Don't you ever slam that door again." And I just saw him as such a funny guy that I just started laughing.
Oh.
And I mean, he didn't do anything, but I think he was really confused. And so it just was a really funny memory that I have, because now looking back, I was like, oh wow, like he was really mad. Like I crossed a line, and I just, had so much fun with him and just thought never did anything that bad that I had never gotten in trouble with him before. So I laughed.
Yeah, because you don't know how to react. And, sometimes it's like, okay, so are you pulling my leg, or are you doing something, what's going on? So, yeah. Interesting. So what was it like growing up and having the grandparents so close to you? Because you were seeing them obviously more often than just holidays or special occasions, right?
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time with them during the holidays, especially because both of my parents worked full time, and I, would kind of go between all of them, just sort of, I guess, depending on the schedule. And, during that time, like I'd spend a lot more time, I think, with my grandmothers than my grandfathers per se. Because I think my grandfathers were mostly working during that time. But it was really great, again, because I got to see all these different hobbies. One of my grandmothers was a teacher, and so I'd spend summers in her classroom, set up all my little Beanie Babies and teach each of them. And then my other grandmother, Marlene, she had a little sewing room up in her attic, and we would sew quilts together and little clothes for my dolls and that sort of thing. And so I really feel blessed, especially because I still have all of them close to me now. I still live within 30 miles of each of them. And it's been a little harder this last year with COVID, not being able to see them, but I have definitely appreciated having them so close a lot more since this has all happened, because I took for granted how close they were and how much time I had with them. And now I'm almost 29 and I'm realizing how lucky I am to be my age and still have each of them. And for the most part, they're all pretty competent and able to communicate and remember me and, can tell me stories.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you're right. You're very lucky in that respect, to still have them around. And what I want to do is move next into those middle school years. So as you're starting to get into those teen years, how did that relationship start to evolve? What were some of the changes, if you remember, when you were hitting those middle school years?
Yeah. So my dad has a funny saying. The common saying is your enemy's enemy is your friend. And he says that it's the same with grandparents and parents and children. The parents and when the grandparents are the parents of the parents, they fight, right? They have that conflict. Parents just have that natural conflict with their own children. And then when they become grandparents, it kind of shifts where, the grandparents seem to be a little bit more loving and doting, on their young grandchildren. They love their grandchildren and they spoil them and they're very close. And so they kind of, I wouldn't say they team up against the parent, but it does seem to have a different relationship. And so I think as I got older, I relied on my grandparents a lot as a sort of either like a buffer or like a sounding board for what was going on in my life with things that I couldn't take to my parents, because they were still my parents, and you knew what you could bring to your parents and what you couldn't, and kind of how they would respond. But with my grandparents, for the most part, it was really easy to talk to them about things that were happening and know that I was not going to be like criticized or judged for feeling the way that I did. And so I understand completely where my dad's coming from, because it very much can be true in that our grandchildren rely on their grandparents as like that friend, that they're more of a friend than a guardian for the most part, just depending on the situation.
Right. And it's interesting that you bring that up. And it's so I've been hearing that common theme amongst people that I talk about, right, with grandparents, and then with people talking about their grandparents, is that idea that if the grandparents can develop that relationship and have that trust and have that love there, that relationship starts to evolve a little bit into kind of a mentoring role. To your point, you know what your parents are going to react when you have something that you need to bring up with them. But the grandparents, and as a child, you don't know this, but the grandparents have maybe a more strategic view or long-term view of some of the decisions that you're weighing out and some of the choices that you're thinking about making. So they give you a different set of advice, right? And it comes from that idea of, hey, here's the love I have for you. I'm going to give you great advice, but I don't have to deal with you on a day-to-day basis like your parents do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciated too, they would never dismiss how I was feeling, with the situation, especially if it was a conflict with my parents. But they would also say and try to help me understand where my parents were coming from. So it was never one-sided, right. They were pretty good about, your mom probably feels this way because of this, and give me a logical explanation that I could wrap my head around and be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And because it was coming from that place of love and from someone that I trusted, I was more receptive to it.
Sure. And then how did that make you feel, knowing that you had somebody in your life that you could take those decisions to, or could vent to, or be able to get that that second set of eyes on an issue. How did that make you feel knowing that you had that in your life?
I think that at the time I didn't appreciate it at all, especially as I got into high school. I was a lot more level-headed as a middle schooler, but in high school I might have not cared as much. But the older I get, and I look back at that time that they gave me, even when I was, being a snotty teenager, I am so appreciative of it because they never gave up on me. They never wrote me off. They never dismissed my feelings or what I was going through. And I'm really lucky that I'm able to thank them now as a 28-year-old and look back on and realize that. I know a lot of people who I speak to about their grandparents, they'll tell me, man, I wish my grandma was still alive, or I wish my grandfather was still alive, so I can tell them how much it meant to me that time, because you just don't realize it in the moment. As a teenager, you're just living your life one day to the next. But then as you get older and you reflect, you realize, wow, they gave me their time without asking for anything back. And that's irreplaceable.
The thing is too, is that, and you're absolutely right, you don't gain that perspective until you've lived long enough to go through the experience, right? So, we all go through that when we're younger. About our parents don't know anything. They're trying to hold us down. They just don't get it. They're being mean to me. There's a lot of those things that come with it. And then as we start to become parents ourselves, we're like, oh, okay, they were trying to do the best they could with what they had, and they actually weren't, these horrible people that sometimes as teenagers we think our parents are. But you don't get there until you start having children of your own and you've had more years of experience there.
Yeah, most definitely. Now that I am a mom myself, I appreciate my parents a lot more too, as well as my grandparents. And so I'm really excited to see I was really close with one of my great grandparents, my papa's mom. And it's fun to see now my daughter be that age and have a great relationship with her great grandparents. And so, yeah, and share all those memories that I distantly remember, but they're also fresh and new for her.
It's a blast to sit back and watch that and go, oh, to your earlier point, right? Your grandfather's got the train set out. So now your daughter's going over there and seeing that train. And now you can sit back and it's like, yeah, I remember when this train was the coolest thing ever. And being, being that age and begging your grandfather to turn on the train, get it going. Why isn't the train moving? You kind of hinted at that, high school, you may have been a handful in high school. So how did that relationship evolve even more? So now you're starting in high school, you've got, you're getting a driver's license, you're getting more independent, you're picking your school schedule. There's boys coming into the picture, all sorts of things that are happening in high school years. And how did the grandparents support you, and how did that relationship evolve even further in high school?
Yeah, so I was really active in musical theater, singing and acting, dancing. I also did some, multimedia arts, video editing and that sort of thing. My grandparents were there like for every single performance, every single, competition that I had. I just remember them being there, and it didn't really matter how far away it was. I had a speech competition when I was in Future Business Leaders of America, and I was competing at the regional level in public speaking. And my grandparents drove up. It was about a 3 or 4 hour drive from where we are. And they were there, they wanted to be there to support me. For most of my grandparents, that was the case. They were all, each of them had their turn. They would sometimes they would coordinate and all go together. And so I'd have a little fan club that was there to support me. And they always just, anything that they felt I was good at, they never hesitated at telling me, oh, Lauren, you're a great writer. Oh, Lauren, you did so well. You're such a great actress, and just all these things. And so there was never a shortage of love and affection in my high school years, even when I was being, not always the nicest to them or to people in general. I was a little angsty as a teenager. They were just super, super supportive of everything that I did. And they were really happy to be there and do that for me. And then I remember when I was 16, I actually helped my grandma Marlene put together a video for her 50th class reunion, her 50th high school reunion. So I went through all these videos, these pictures of her as a teenager and her classmates, and put it all together for her. And she was just so happy and to have me do that. And so they also just really utilized me and gave me opportunities to practice the things that I was good at. And it kind of was I guess an indicator of what I would go into, now with my own things that I have going on.
Oh, very cool. And, and it gives your grandparents a chance to brag on you too, when they're handing out the project that you're working on, and, hey, this is what my granddaughter did, and here's how she did all this stuff. And so there must have been a bunch of pride with your grandparents when they were handing out that 50th high school movie and media presentation.
Oh yeah, she was super happy with it, and I actually got to be there for their reunion when they showed it. And so it was actually sort of jarring, because I don't remember what year did she graduate. I think it was like 1955.
Okay.
And so it was 2005 when we did the project, and I just remember seeing all these like handsome teenagers, from 1955, and like, oh, that guy's really cute, because I'm a teenage girl, of course, and then seeing them 50 years later as grown men who were grandparents. It was just really kind of funny, but it was really exciting to talk to all of them and just go over those pictures with them. It was a really cute memory.
How did things evolve even further once you were getting out of high school and, you're now a young adult and heading off to college? And so, how did things evolve even more for you guys? And how did those traditions evolve for you too, now that, you're a young adult?
Yeah, so I actually spent a year in Illinois, and it was from July to July. It was hard. It was different. But I was a pretty independent young woman. I was kind of determined to make my own way in the world. And my grandparents, of course, supported that journey and asked how they could help and that sort of thing. And I remember my papa, he was like, his advice for me when I left home for the first time was always keep $100 on you. You never know when you're going to have. I probably shouldn't say that out loud, because now people are going to assume that I have $100 on me at every time. But, it was just, and then he gave me $100 bill, and, he was just like, here's to start you off. And, just kind of gave me a nice send off dinner. And I think he's always just been really proud of me and happy to help in any way he can. And so, and it was the same for everyone else. I think they were sad to see me go, but they knew I had that sort of drive to go out in the world and do things on my own. And so they never gave me a hard time about it. They were always very supportive. They were, of course, really excited when I moved back. And as far as the traditions go, not much has changed. For me, it's still, we go to my papa's on Christmas Eve, and that's that. And my husband has to sort of live with that. We don't change that for much anymore, except for this past year. And so we try to keep up the traditions. I think for some of my family, it's been harder as everyone's kind of gotten older and had their own children and grandchildren. And so some of those regular things have kind of fallen off, but we still try to to get together and do things as a family at least once a year. And that's always really special.
Oh, that's great that you can still do that and that you guys are close enough to do that. I know I've got siblings kind of all over the country, and for us to get together, it's a huge undertaking. And I know, of course, my mom, and who's grandma now for, I don't know, a dozen or more grandkids, she would love to have it much more often. So definitely lucky for you to have that experience, and for your daughter to be having that experience and growing up with some of those traditions and seeing her, great grandma and great grandpas. We got connected through Dan Miller's 48 Days community, and that I discovered was that you were starting this project in a blog that was returning time. And I thought it was interesting, and would love to have you go into this a little bit and talk about what inspired you to start this project, and what is the project, so that if people are interested, they can find it and learn more about it.
Yeah, so it's, as you said, it's called Returning Time. I sort of mentioned that I'm almost 29, and each of my grandparents are still alive. They're still with us and competent, able to talk to me. For one in particular, it's gotten a little bit hard, but for the most part, I call all of them and talk to them on the phone pretty regularly. I just sort of, as I was getting older, realized how rare that is for anyone of my age to have grandparents still living. At least some may have at least one, but a lot of times we've lost at least one by the time you've gotten to this age. And I actually have two to spare. So my papa Fred is married to my grandma Donna, and they've also been married since before I was born. So she's just always been Grandma Donna. And same with my grandpa Jerry. He's been married to my grandma Marlene. He's Grandpa Jerry. I see his family history, which he also likes to track and record as my family history, even though I don't know many of the people in his family. And so it's just, the older I got, the more I was like, wow, I need to be talking to them more regularly. I need to be writing this down, recording it in some way, so that I have this. It's sort of in some ways it's a little selfish, because I want a piece of them forever. I want to have that forever because they're so special to me. And as I've gotten older, they've become more and more special. But as I thought about the people who could benefit from this, I actually have first cousins who are younger than my daughter. So my daughter is 7, and I have 5 first cousins that are below her in age. And so I sort of, when I'm thinking about those younger cousins, they're not going to have this experience with my grandparents like I have. My great grandmother, who I was really close with, she had dementia. And so I remember spending a lot of time with her, but as her disease progressed, she forgot who I was. And that was really scary for me. I remember being kind of traumatized as a child that she couldn't remember who I was. And I just think about how my younger cousins are probably going to go through that at a pretty young age, at some point. I hope that it's not for a while, but inevitably that's part of life. And right. So I want something of my grandparents that, shows them sort of in their prime, where they're able to communicate and talk and share their stories. And then I just also think about how our lives as people on a grander scale, we're all connected, and we all have these really beautiful stories to tell, different experiences in different parts of the country. I know you interviewed Vinnie Tortoridge on your podcast, and his story is very similar. His family history of immigrating from Sicily to New Orleans Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
but
no, they came over from Italy. Yeah, ended up in New Orleans, and that was one of the big questions I had was, how'd a bunch of Italians end up in New Orleans versus New York or Boston or, your traditional East Coast ports of entry? And so, yeah, he was telling me, no, New Orleans was a big port of entry for immigrants, especially from Italy.
Yeah. Yeah. So my great grandparents were in that area for a long time before they moved out to California. And so I think that now there's so much going on with like ancestry.com and, the DNA testing and that sort of thing. I can imagine that these are going to become more and more important as this generation passes on, because there's not, we have to kind of maintain these stories for them. I went to a thrift shop not that long ago, or like it was an antique shop, and there was a photo album there from like the late 1800s, and it was just there for sale.
Wow.
And I'm like, that's someone's family, that's someone's history right there in this shop on sale
right.
for $48. And, that would break my heart to imagine that these pieces, these stories are, would just end up in an antique sale after an estate sale or something, so.
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing that you're doing this, because a couple of episodes ago, I had interviewed Heather, Amy, and Kim Rupertus about their grandfather, who was Major General William Rupertus. And this gentleman had been born in 1889, had been a major general in the early war in the Pacific in World War II, and died in 1945. So they never met him. He died when their father was 5 years old. And so they're going through and documenting his history, and they're lucky in terms of he had diaries, and there was a lot about him in the Marine Corps history and also National Archives. But they were talking about there's just gaps in his life that they didn't know, and they didn't know him, and they felt that very much that there was a gap in their own life. As they started doing that history, they were filling in those gaps with their life and in their families' lives. It went from being, to your point, it went from being old photo albums that were sitting in totes up in the attic and documents dispersed amongst the family members, to now they've got a family history program going and a book that's coming out. But so many of us don't have those recordings. There's Super 8 video when people started doing home movies in probably, the 40s and 50s and 60s and so on, and VHS tapes when those recordings were out. But sometimes it's not all collected and put together. And so your project of sitting down with your grandparents and going through and really documenting this out is going to be incredible for your daughter and your grandkids when they want to find out, hey, let me go back a few generations, and now I can hear great-great-grandfather's story about moving from Louisiana to California, and then his family's history of buying up some of the orange orchards that you had talked about, during the Depression, and how they were able to grow and put together a farm. Just go through that whole experience. And so that is very, very fortunate that you're able to do that. And what a gift for future generations in your family.
Yeah, thank you. It's so special. And the more the further along we get into it, the more I'm just like, wow, there's so much to unpack here. It's really no shortage of stories and things to be learned. The further that I talk to my papa, I want to extend this to each of my grandparents, as long as, the good Lord will let me have the time to do that,
No, that's great. So, where can people go to find what your project is, and how can they get in contact with you?
The website is www.returningtime.com. Right now I'm doing one once a week, usually on Saturdays. And I'm also putting together, I'm not just doing show notes for the podcast. I'm actually writing the blog out and kind of elaborating where I can on the stories. So the blog, it's almost word for word what the podcast is, but I'm trying to go back and add links and, kind of expand on things if I need to, if it was just, something that I found that was interesting.
Sure.
But yeah, so www.returningtime.com. And it's also on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Okay. And we will also put the link to that show in the website as well for my show notes and my helpful links and that. So anybody listening, if you didn't have a chance to write it down, go to my show notes and we'll have a link over to Lauren's project. One thing too, as we start to wrap up, I'm going to ask you about, well, I guess two things technically. One is there anything else about your relationship with your grandparents that you would like to talk about?
Yeah. So the name of my podcast is called Returning Time. And I thought a while about what I wanted to call this, because I wanted something that would kind of touch on each of my grandparents, not just, I could have called it, Sicilian Americans and growing up in California and all these things. But I wanted it to touch on each of my very diverse grandparents. But as I kind of spoke about, my grandparents gave me a lot of their time, as far as, coming to my events and teaching me how to sew, or, letting me watch them do woodworking in their garage, or, going to a Civil War reenactment. That was time that they decided to give me of their free will. And so when I was thinking about what to call it, I was like, well, I'm going to sit down with them and return to them that time that they gave to me. And really, that's all it was. It wasn't like they were, giving me money every Christmas, which there was, they would give good gifts and that sort of thing. But I don't remember the gifts. I don't remember how much money they gave me. I remember most the time that they spent with me and the time that they spent sharing the things that they loved with me. And so when I think about my relationship with them, and the most important thing, I would say that it's that. And I try to live that with my daughter. It's harder as a parent because you have all these things you're managing in your head of, to-do lists and things to do and that sort of thing. But, I know my parents have also taken that to heart and giving their time to my daughter as well.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And then the other thing too is any advice that you would give to grandparents, and anything that you would want to share with even, me as a young grandparent, because you've laid out a lot, but if you could break it down to one helpful tip to share with me, what would it be?
So my advice to grandparents would be, don't be afraid to keep giving that time to your grandchildren, and also sharing things that you might not think are interesting. I'm not a woodworker, but I appreciate woodworking. I don't sew anymore, but I appreciate sewing. So a lot of the things that I'm watching on YouTube are woodworkers and people who sew. And, they have these very beautiful, elaborate projects that I'm just in awe of, but I appreciate the time. I can appreciate the time because I've seen that firsthand in person with my grandparents working on their own things. And so I would just say, keep involving them. Don't force it on them, but have them help, have them do things with you, tactile things. I think tactile things are really important because that's something that we've kind of lost over time. It's easy to sit in front of a TV and watch a show. And sure, you can have memories of, oh, I remember watching this show with my grandfather. And I don't want to dismiss that at all. But I think tactile things really are how we build relationships. And it kind of has been throughout, human history. So if you have anything like that you can share with them, that would be my greatest advice. Because I know that they may not appreciate it now, but one day they'll look back and just see how special that time was with you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Lauren, for sharing that. And Lauren, I really do appreciate you taking time out and talking with me and sharing your experience about your awesome grandfathers and your grandparents in general. So thank you again. And folks, be sure to go over and check out Returning Time. It'll be well worth it if you're interested in family history, if you're interested in even the history of California and Italian immigrants into California. It's going to have a lot of great information for you. So be sure to go check that out. And thanks again, Lauren, for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a blast. I appreciate it.
What a cool conversation that was with Lauren. I'm so glad that I got to meet her and talk with her, and that you guys have had this experience as well. It's very unique to have a conversation with a young woman who is a young mother and still has her grandparents around and has the opportunity to sit down and talk with them about their experiences, as well as what their families, meaning fathers and their grandfathers and grandmothers, went through in immigrating to the United States, and the family stories and histories. You know, she's capturing these things, and they're amazing stories. I mean, talk about going into the Central Valley of California during the time of the Depression and realizing that you could buy orange orchards for just being able to take over mortgage payments, that the banks had so much property that was coming in that was so valuable, but there were little to no buyers, that if you could just take over payments, you could have an orange orchard. So that was just one of the many incredible stories that we heard and talked about. The big aha thing for me was just that Lauren had flipped the script a little bit with understanding that her grandparents had made a lot of sacrifices, joyfully so, to be at Lauren's speech competitions, to be at her activities, to make sure that she had family to go to while her parents were working and she was out of school on school holidays. And that she's turned that back into a concept of returning time, that the grandparents have spent so much time invested in her and spent so much of their time in her that she's now turning that around and spending time and returning that favor, so to speak, by interviewing them and capturing their stories so that it's around for her daughter and for the rest of the generations of her family line. So let me know what your aha moment was or what you enjoyed about this conversation, and shoot me an email at greg@cool-grandpa.com for the email, or go to the website www.cool-grandpa.us and leave a comment in the show notes. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing well, and remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.